Probably the biggest questions we're getting from people are related to, is there an accurate testing methodology? How do we know if somebody used today, 3 weeks ago, things of that nature, because employers are challenged as how to handle that in their policy and in their workplace. If somebody has a medical marijuana card, they obviously don't want that individual using at work. They don't want that individual coming in under the influence. The problem is there's not been a clear definition given as to what it means to be under the influence of marijuana, how long that lasts after somebody smokes, things of that nature. With urine drug testing, it's always been an issue as to the window of detection. Somebody who smokes marijuana and then takes a urine drug test, they could test positive for a couple days, a couple weeks, maybe even a couple months in certain circumstances. And so if somebody fails their drug test and they say it's been 3 weeks ago, there's really no way to prove or disprove that. So employers are challenged, and what we have been recommending is the consideration of oral fluid testing, because it has a much shorter window of detection, typically 4 to maybe 12 hours after ingestion. And if an individual has an oral fluid drug test and they test positive for marijuana and they claim it was last weekend and today's Thursday, the math just doesn't add up. The biggest comparison we probably work with is a breath alcohol device. The science is there for breath alcohol, the dissipation rates, the accumulation rates. That's pretty much been scientifically validated. So we know that the average individual increases their alcohol concentration somewhere between 0.01 to 0.02 for every drink that they consume. And it takes roughly about an hour for that to dissipate out of their system. In the marijuana and the other drug fields, that science has not been fully developed. They've been toying with particular levels of violation, but how long it takes to dissipate, how long the person is under the influence, they're still working on that. They do not have an accurate device to measure. There are a number of articles we've read about, a few colleges across the country, some work in Canada, some work in England, where they are working on developing those devices. Right now it's for forensic purposes, which means law enforcement will be using them. But how soon it will get to the workplace and there would actually be a breath marijuana device, right now it's anybody's guess. Not that I've seen at this point, not saying it's not happened. We have a couple of attorneys that we refer companies to for consulting purposes, policy development, and they are on the forefront of those kind of topics. We did have last year, HR Advantage had us sit on a panel with an attorney and a doctor. And one of the comments the attorney made that stuck out in my mind was, there are a lot of unknown issues related to the passage of medical marijuana, and we probably won't know the answer until we cross that bridge. So there's a big learning curve. There are some definite steps that companies can take in developing their policy, not so much targeting marijuana as much as targeting coming to work under the influence of any type of medication or product that could impair their ability to safely work in the workplace. So what's so big about a drug testing program? It seems like more people are focused on marijuana than potentially other performance inhibiting drugs. So over the course of our training sessions, and probably for the last 4 years, we've emphasized that drug and alcohol testing is all about safety in the workplace. I can be taking a prescription medication legitimately. If I twist my ankle and I have to use hydrocodone for the next 3 weeks, I can be taking it exactly the way the doctor told me, but it has an impairing effect. So many companies are beginning to develop policies that say if you're on any kind of medication that could in any way impair your ability to safely operate this vehicle or this piece of equipment, then you're going to be put on light duty. So the focus on marijuana is really not just marijuana, it's safety in the workplace. And what can impact that? Marijuana could, prescription pain pills could, alcohol could. So your drug and alcohol testing program is very much well-rounded. Somebody has a medical marijuana card. Well, number one, at this time, it's not considered a prescription. So it doesn't meet the criteria. Therefore, it's not considered a quote-unquote legitimate explanation for the presence of marijuana, especially in the federal testing or the DOT world. But using a medical marijuana card really is no different than having a prescription, because they're both quote-unquote legal, and yet they both have a negative impact on a person's ability to safely perform their duties and therefore safety in the workplace. Again, going back to what is or what is not a medical marijuana card. Basically, a medical marijuana card is simply a card that gives the individual permission to go to a Missouri licensed, or if it's in another state, a licensed facility, and purchase a set amount of marijuana, or to grow, have a certain number of plants in their possession. But it is not recognized as a prescription. Basically, an individual goes to a physician that makes an evaluation on the individual, and in the medical professional's opinion, feels that marijuana could be beneficial to that individual. So they are given a recommendation. In Missouri, they have to take that recommendation and go on to HSS's website and actually apply. And if they are approved, then they are given a medical marijuana card, and our understanding is that would be good for 365 days and allow you to have marijuana within the parameters of that card. But you then don't take that card and go to Walgreens or Walmart or something like that and give it to the physician. He's going to look at you like you're crazy. It's not recognized as a prescription. In the federal world, under DOT testing, the medical review officer will tell you the same thing. In order for a drug to be considered a legal medicinal reason for it present in a person's drug test, it has to be a result of a physician who's given a prescription and knows the donor's medical history. It's not a prescription. Sometimes the doctor may know the cardholder's background, they may not. So it doesn't meet the criteria set forth under federal regulations for a legitimate medical explanation, and therefore the MRO will deem a positive drug test if somebody says it's marijuana because of a card, it's marijuana because of CBD. In a drug test, the only thing that's being tested for in a confirmation test is the presence of THC. And THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, is one of over 100 different cannabinoids found in the cannabis plant. Cannabidiol, or CBD, is another one of those cannabinoids. And we have CB receptors in the body, CB1s and CB2s. Depending on where the particular cannabinoid attaches, it can have a psychoactive impact or it can have a physical benefit. So we're asked in seminars, are there medicinal benefits to marijuana? And our answer is probably so. A lot of research hasn't been done because it's been considered a Schedule I drug, and therefore it's hard to evaluate, but there's being more and more research. The problem with CBD is that by definition it's supposed to come from the hemp plant. And the hemp plant means it has 0.3% or less of THC. If that's true, then using CBD oil would have virtually no impact on a result of a drug test. Because for a drug test to be considered positive, there has to be 15 nanograms per milliliter of THC or more. So a positive marijuana drug test is positive only for THC, not CBD. But if there's THC in a person's system, it had to get there somehow. So if an individual says, all I did was use CBD oils, then apparently there's more THC in that CBD oil than what the manufacturer is letting on, or the potential is the individual has done more than just use CBD oil. We can't determine the difference between the two. The laboratories aren't trying to. They are only looking for the presence of THC. DOT is dealing with marijuana in a very simple fashion. And when we do webinars, it sounds maybe a little simplistic, but it is what it is. We basically tell CDL drivers and so forth, a positive is a positive is a positive. Because THC is a Schedule I drug and there's no legitimate medical explanation, quote unquote, at this time for it, in all federal testing, if somebody tests positive, it means they've tested positive for THC at 15 nanograms or above for only THC, and therefore it will be ruled as a positive test. If marijuana were ever to be dropped to a Schedule II drug or something of that nature, obviously that would be a game changer. At this point in time, I've seen proposals saying so, just haven't seen anything recently saying, yep, that's going to happen. When it comes to drug and alcohol testing programs and policies, a lot of companies may not do random testing. There's 4 primary reasons for testing. There's a pre-employment test, a random test, an after-accident test, and then what's called a reasonable suspicion. Almost every policy that I've ever read will test for reasonable suspicion. Post-accident is probably the second most common reason, pre-employment, and then lastly random. So we tell people there are 2 methodologies that are reactive and 2 testing reasons that are proactive. The reactive ones are the post-accident and reasonable suspicion. Something happens before a test is ever conducted. The preemptive or proactive are the pre-employment and random. We're trying to be preventative in nature. So in light of that, most companies, or all companies I've seen, do reasonable suspicion. Federal regulations say that supervisors of safety-sensitive people in each federal program are required to go through at least 60 minutes of drug recognition training and 60 minutes of alcohol recognition training for the purpose of reasonable suspicion testing. Some states require that much training and even annual refresher trainings. So there's a federal requirement, sometimes a state requirement, and then a company requirement. So we've designed our reasonable suspicion training programs to meet the minimum requirements set forth by federal guidelines. The typical session is about 2.5 hours. And we spend an average of 60 minutes talking about things to look for in an individual that could potentially be under the influence of alcohol. We talk about the 5 main drugs that are included in a federal drug test and characteristics that are associated with that. We get into the fact that there are medical conditions that could mimic a person being under the influence. We're not trying to make people drug recognition experts, but rather we're giving them some basic tools on things that they can look for. And just by its very name, reasonable suspicion is just that. It's not an accusation, it's not a definitive decision, but rather an individual is demonstrating characteristics that could be consistent with drug or alcohol misuse, and therefore as a part of a company's safety program, reasonable suspicion testing would take place. And then we go into a few more things towards the end of our presentations where we talk about the actual steps to take to do a reasonable suspicion test, the observations that are required by trained supervisors, the documentation process, even how to get a test done. We talk about some do's and don'ts, and we try to encourage people to make sure that everything they do is as defensible as possible should someone actually test positive and then challenge it. So we go into confidentiality, and other things of that nature to give the employer as many tools as possible. Again, not to try to quote unquote catch somebody, but rather to be safety conscious and to be preventative of somebody actually getting hurt on the job. If somebody were to call in, and again, what services beyond just the actual testing does TOMO provide? If a company calls in and is even interested in our services, typically the first couple steps that we will take is asking them questions about their policy, what they're currently doing. In many instances, we'll ask them to send us a copy of their policy. Now, we cannot write policies, but we do have legal consultants that can assist with that. We can evaluate the policies just based upon our years of experience to see what's there and what's not there. Many times people want to do something, but their current policy doesn't support that. So we recommend that they revamp that. One of the questions we ask folks to consider is what drugs could impact your workplace safety. There's different drugs can be included in the drug test. You might have heard of a 5-panel or 7-panel, a 12-panel. Some people just want the very basics. Some companies have eliminated marijuana from their drug test because they can't find enough workers that can pass the initial drug test. So there's a lot of different factors that come into play. But we'll ask who's subject to testing, the circumstances for which they want to be tested. We'll talk about the drugs that might be included in the test and develop a program that best suits their needs and at the same time can be implemented them effectively. In talking with work comp providers, one of the big factors necessary for a company to defend its work comp claim against somebody who's failed a drug or an alcohol test is your policy and your practices consistent? If you say you're going to do pre-employment drug test, are you actually doing it? If you're going to do random testing, are you actually doing it? Or is it just there in word? So practices and policies are consistent. And then we recommend that people actually look at their policies every 1 to 2 years just to make sure it's current. Some things that people tested for 5, 10 years ago, really not relevant. So mix it up, change it. 5 years ago, we probably weren't talking about saliva testing. Now it's one of the premier ways of testing people to determine recency of usage. But many policies don't allow for alternative methods of testing. They specifically say urine. Things have to be updated.